Hello and welcome. My name is Daniel Hanna. I'm the Head of Sustainable Finance at Standard Chartered, and I'm very pleased to be here on Energy Day at COP, speaking amongst and moderating a very distinguished panel. We are here to talk about companies should focus on financing the transition of their business models instead of spending money on carbon capture and storage. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Alan Haywood, from BP, Sam McCullough from the IEA, and Ita Kettleborough from the Energy Transitions Commission. First of all, let me declare a little bit of a bias here. Standard Chartered is the chair of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, and last week we published our 2030 net zero interim targets, a commitment to mobilise $300 billion in green and transition finance, and an expectation that our clients in power, oil and gas and mining should have a transition plan in place by the end of 2022. We also published a transition finance framework, which we think is one of the most transparent out there, and it does include CCS. With that caveat at the front, let me kick off our conversation, and maybe if I can turn to Alan to begin with. Actually, the Institute of Energy Economics and Financial Analysis yesterday put a note out saying COP26 needs to focus on scaling renewables as fast as possible, not fanciful technology. Shouldn't we all be focusing on how we scale renewables rather than technological fixes like CCS for fossil fuels?
That sounds like a great question to kick off. So thank you, Daniel. Thank you for the opportunity. I mean, I think the real point here is that we are facing a really very, very severe challenge. And actually, it's going to take all of us. And I think that the idea about focusing on one idea or one technology actually isn't appropriate. What we need to do fundamentally in a world with a finite carbon budget is to reduce the carbon which goes into the atmosphere. Now, we have to balance the energy sources which provide ultimately the energy to the peoples of the world. And some of that for the foreseeable future will come from oil and gas, and an increasing amount will come from renewables. So I think simultaneously we need to build out the renewables, but also we need to look to decarbonize the traditional fuels of oil and gas. And therefore, and supporting what the IEA has said about the role of CCUS, we need to decarbonize particularly gas, and therefore, decarbonize gas in the form of blue hydrogen, in combination with things like biofuels, which can also have a CCUS element. I think we need to be focused on all of these technologies, Daniel, not trying to pick and choose between them. We need the investment to come into them all simultaneously.
Great, thanks, Alan. And that's actually a great segue, I think, to my first question to Sam then. Alan just referred to the IEA net zero pathway, and I have to again maybe declare that we use that in terms of our net zero analysis. Yeah. But is it realistic? I mean, do the policy prescriptions that you've kind of put out there really match what is of emissions reductions from CCS technology? That technology is only really at the sort of prototype stage at the moment. I mean, is it realistic to be building this into a way of achieving all the things that Alan talked about in terms of the decarbonisation options? Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks, Daniel, and good afternoon, everyone. Look, I think the IEA Net Zero Roadmap that we released in May this year really highlights the fundamental transformation in how we use, transport, produce energy, the sort of fundamental that needs to happen globally to reach net zero by 2050. And I would echo Alan's comments around the need for a portfolio of technologies and solutions. And CCUS is certainly one of those important solutions. We do need a very, very significant scale up of CCUS to reach net zero goals. IEA has highlighted that actually CCUS is essential to reaching net zero for a number of reasons. In terms of the technology challenges, Daniel, you've identified that, one of the findings of our was really that by 2050, around % of the emissions reductions that we need in 2050 are actually from technologies that today are demonstration or prototype stages. CCS amongst that, but I would highlight that particularly for challenges are not so much the technology, it's really commercial at this point. Here we're talking about a suite of technology with different applications, with different costs. We're seeing very significant progress now with these technologies, particularly in the US and in Europe, because the investment environment has changed. So, that in itself is signalling that the technologies are ready to come to market where the conditions make it investable.
Thanks, Sam. And maybe, Ita, can I turn to you now? I mean, I think Sam just talked about the sort of financing conditions, the technology being available in Western markets. But what about the rest of the world? What about in the developing countries? We have, almost 1 billion of people that don't have access to any kind of energy at the moment. How do we sort of balance the technology and the importance of creating a just transition for those markets? And at the same time, the sort of importance of creating energy resilience in these systems. I think we've even seen in Europe, for example, over the last couple of months, issues around sort of energy shortages. How do you see that playing out in terms of the energy system mix?
It's a really important question as we think about the feasibility of delivering this transition, which at the Energy Transitions Commission, we are very much believe that building a net zero economy across the world globally by mid-century is technically feasible. As Sam's just said, that many of the technologies are available. They may need to be commercialized, they may need to scale, but they are available. And it's also economically feasible. And we would argue that it's feasible not only in the richer nations, but also across the world. And while I would absolutely agree that there is a place for a range of technologies, I think it is important to recognize that a net zero global economy will be built on cheap electricity. We are transitioning from a world today where we have about 20% of final energy demand globally met by electricity to a world where it could be IEA scenario 50%, we would say perhaps 60 or even a bit more could be direct electricity. And that will predominantly be in the form of very, very cheap wind and solar. So I think I would certainly echo and agree the importance of scaling up these other technologies. But I also agree with your initial question that we need to really focus on scaling renewables. And the thing about renewables is in many ways, they can be more distributed. Renewable, wind and solar conditions are available across the world. That most countries in the world will be able to meet their electricity needs from their own wind and solar. There are some, especially countries with very high population densities, where this could be a challenge, Bangladesh being a good example. But for most countries in the world, they actually have the wind and solar resources that they need. It's also a very cheap technology. Wind and solar have both collapsed so massively that we're building a system where the bulk is going to be cheaper than before. But that doesn't mean that we don't need to think about the real challenges of balancing a variable renewable, so a grid that is built with intermittent energy generation. And what we've seen in Europe over the last year is if we don't think about planning this correctly, if we don't think about deploying a suite of technologies to also balance the grid correctly, to allow the grid, then there can be challenges with these short-term shocks that drive prices up. And at the moment, those prices are often passed on to consumers, which isn't very fair. So I think really what we would say is it's possible to build a renewable-dominated grid. It's possible to balance a renewable-dominated grid with technologies available, and also including CCS on gas might be one of those. Also hydrogen, if we have clean hydrogen, and we can use that to balance the grid. So we have the technologies, we have to be able to balance them. But if we plan this and we think this through, and if we're committed to what we and the leaders have committed us to over this last 2 weeks or week, it's possible and it's feasible.
That's really, I think that's very clear. Thank you. And I maybe just picking up on that, in some ways, I think we've got the playbook for financing renewables. We just need to do it on a much bigger scale. Yeah. Do we have the playbook for the other technologies you just mentioned, hydrogen, CCS? And I mean, yesterday we were here at Finance Day at COP, and we had $130 trillion sort of lined up against a net zero commitment. What is it that the finance sector needs to do differently to really accelerate renewables on the one hand, and then really start scaling and building these newer technologies?
I'd say on renewables, we have got some of the financing, But what we would say we don't yet have is financing at the pace and scale that is needed. And really what we're talking about there is making sure we have the right power market design to reduce the risks associated with these assets and kind of unleash the large amounts of private capital that want to find good returns. So if we can think about designing our power markets to enable, to kind of optimize for wind and solar. So one of those things is, can we think about long-term contract structures or continued use of auctions structures, even if there isn't a subsidy? So historically, auctions were used with wind and solar to subsidise that technology. Could we use them in the future, not to subsidise, but just to reduce risk? So first of all, I think there is still a challenge on the renewables about really getting the scale. On the other technologies, I think there's a range of pieces that need to be in place there. The real, I think, Samantha, the work of the IEA that Sam was referring to really demonstrated that we have these technologies, we believe they can be deployed. What we don't have at the moment is the markets for the demand for those zero carbon products. So we can produce green and blue hydrogen, we can start to install CCS, but we don't yet have the markets for those products, which either need to be through corporates, voluntary procurement commitments to zero carbon products, or through regulations, so fuel mandates, for instance. We need to see we need to kind of strengthen the business case of these early technologies to enable their scaling in the next decade.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you. I mean, Sam, it sounds like finance isn't the problem then. It's all about market design and sort of long-term contracts and structuring. Do you sort of agree with that? Is capital not the issue here? Is actually about the sort of how we create the right energy system?
So I think there's still a challenge there in the sense that we really need to grow the amount of investment that we're seeing going into clean energy. The IEA has suggested that at least $1 trillion would need to be spent in the period to 2023 just to put the world on track for sustainable recoveries. I think currently we have a really unique opportunity in many ways in terms of the government stimulus packages and using that as an opportunity to really kickstart investment in some of these technologies, and particularly the infrastructure that we know we need for things like CCUS and hydrogen. At the IEA, we've been tracking the sort of recovery spending, and today only around 3% of recovery spending is going to clean energy technologies. So I think that's one aspect to look at in more detail. But generally, we need to make clean energy technologies, investable. And for some technologies, solar and wind, we've seen enormous improvements there. The technology costs are coming down, and these are really very much financeable technologies. But we need to also ensure that we're broadening the scope and the portfolio of technologies that are receiving capital, and also from a global perspective, ensuring that more and more of the investment is going to emerging markets and developing economies. So that's something else that the IEA has really identified, that even though these are areas where we see very significant energy growth, currently only around 20% of clean energy investment is actually occurring in those sort of emerging markets. So that's something else that would need further sort of attention, I think, as we move forward.
Yeah, no, I think, Sam, that's a really important point. Actually, we put out a report last year in terms of our own financing of this, and we found that $1 invested in a solar project in India has 7 times the impact of emissions reduction versus the same sort of solar project dollar going in France, just because of the grid displacement factor. Yet we're not really seeing enough capital moving to the emerging markets to accelerate that decarbonisation. I don't know, Alan, if you've got a thought around how do we get capital, how do we get the technology to move at scale into these emerging countries, not just into the developed world?
Well, I'll come to that if I can, Daniel, but I just do want to pick up and make sure that I reinforce a point, which is I don't think that we should have an either-or conversation. I do think we need an and conversation. I mean, in a world where we need to reduce carbon, we can't unfortunately flip the switch overnight to a renewables world. I completely agree that the world will electrify. I completely agree that a lot of the growth in that supply of electricity will come from renewables, and that's great. But in the short term, and don't forget, we need to make progress quickly. This is, people are reminding us about the progress we need to make by 2030 as well as by 2050. I think a part of that is how we decarbonize, some of the traditional fuels of oil and gas. And that's why, I would emphasize something like CCS. And I would also say, let's not characterize it as some new technology which isn't in practice already. There are examples of it, significant examples. We need to scale, as we need to scale up in renewables very quickly, because a lot of this conversation is about pace and how we scale reducing carbon and alternatives to traditional fuels. So I think we need to do that. And we also need to recognize, and I think that's partly where this conversation is going, different regions will have a different emphasis. And, there's not a single path and there's not a sort of single pace around the world. But, I think it is encouraging. I mean, we're seeing, it's not quite emerging markets, but, the government did announce that they would support our East Coast cluster, which is a project, to bring gas ashore in Humberside and Teesside, to decarbonize it, to sequester the carbon dioxide, to create hydrogen for industry. And actually that will take away something like almost half of the emissions of the industrial clusters in the UK. How can we then sort of make sure that finance goes into those projects and into the emerging markets? I think we need to de-risk in some cases. So who takes the risk? Sometimes government policy is going to be important. I think a carbon price will send a great signal to people and give some degree of confidence in this. But I'm also saying not only do we need to attract finance into the new activities, I think we need to make sure that the decarbonisation of oil and gas as part of the transition is also recognised. And I think that's been one of the questions which the EU taxonomy has had to face, Daniel, about, we recognise what is green and therefore absolutely, needs to be funded. But I think there are also some transitional activities. So if we can sort of have an and conversation rather than an either or, I think that's important.
I think, Anna, it's a good point. And we clearly need all tools in the toolbox. And I think so. we also probably need, sorry, Ita, did you want to come in? No, okay, sorry, I saw you move. Anna, are the oil and gas companies doing enough here? What else needs to happen to accelerate the transition in the industry as well?
I think, we need to recognise that there's not a single answer, there's not a single strategy from the oil and gas companies. I mean, my own company, BP, is saying, there will be a need for some oil and gas in the future, but I think probably reflecting the IEA's net zero scenario, we see, that there will be a significantly less need for it. But, that which will be required, particularly in the hard to abate sectors, will need to be decarbonised. A strategy to decarbonise. There's a strategy in our case to increase significantly tenfold by 2030 the amount of capital we're putting into new activities. I think it's always a fair challenge to say, are we moving quickly enough? And we need, I think, some policy support. We need financial support. As I said earlier on, I do think the economic signal of a carbon price, would be extremely helpful. And, we need to embrace some of the new technologies. There's no question about that. But do I think, oil and gas companies are moving? I can only speak ultimately for BP and say, when we announced our ambition to be net zero by 2050 or sooner, it felt like a very substantial, we called it reimagining of energy and a reinvention of BP. And, I think our actions, so investing in wind projects, investing in electric charging, investing in CCS, I think they're all examples of people taking steps to move at pace. So always more to be done and always more we can learn and listen from other people. But I do think, at least I feel BP is in action, Daniel.
Thank you. Ita, maybe I come back to you. You sort of said that you see electrification playing an even bigger role than the IEA scenario. So does that mean there's a smaller role even then for the oil and gas industry at a quicker pace? And do you see more steps that that industry and actually the other hard to abate sectors need to be taking?
So I think our perspective on the harder to abate sectors is that all sectors of the economy can and should decarbonise in and of themselves. In many cases, the electrification can be used, but as has been very clear, it is not possible to use electricity for all use cases. We think that clean hydrogen will have a very large role to play alongside electrification, and that there may well be we think the majority of that in the long term is likely to come from green hydrogen, from electrolysis, effectively extending the reach of renewables. But in the transition, indeed, also blue playing a really significant role. We also, bioenergy will play a role. I think the big caution we would put on bio is that you have to make sure it's truly sustainable biomass. And that actually limits it. It makes it quite a constrained and valuable resource, that part of the global biomass production that we can actually dedicate to industry and energy. And so finally you come to CCS, and we do believe that there is a role for CCS and that it needs to scale very, very rapidly from where it is today. Cement, it's difficult to see a solution for decarbonising cement. Cement, you produce CO2 in the process of producing it. Also DACs, so direct air carbon capture, we say very clearly all sectors need to decarbonise in and of themselves by mid-century, but alongside that, to stay in our carbon budget, we'll need to use carbon dioxide removals, both in the form of natural climate solutions, which we think is a big role, but also in engineered solutions, including using direct air capture and storage alongside the CCS. So absolutely, it is a part and a critical part of the overall system, but with a clean electrification at the core.
Very clear. One thing that hasn't come up at all actually in the conversation that I'm intrigued, we're almost out of time, so maybe in a word, and it will be a word, do you see a role for carbon credits in the financing of this transition? Maybe Sam, you go first.
Yes, I think we need all tools, and carbon credits can play a role. And I'll just echo the points on CCUS. I just wanted to be clear that CCUS is not just a fossil fuel technology. So the role extending to things like direct air capture, bioenergy, industrial process emissions. There's a range of emissions that CCUS can play a role in addressing.
Great. Alan?
Yes, definitely. But I also think that the industry needs to go to, true decarbonisation through, avoiding methane losses, through, reducing flaring. But carbon and, NCS has a play. But I echo the point of it has to be real, it has to be verified, and probably shouldn't be the first resort. It should be something we use in addition to the other tools we have.
Great, thank you. Aita?
I think, the compliance market will be critical, and that's a form of emissions trading, so those kind of EU ETS as creating carbon pricing signals. Voluntary markets, there's probably a complementary role, but indeed it's a complementary role alongside.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Alan, Sam and Aita. I certainly learned a lot in that conversation. I'm sure we could have spoken for a lot more time. And I'd just like to say thank you to all the three excellent panellists and wish everyone else a very interesting COP ahead of ourselves. Thank you.